Hi, my name is Rebecca Zash, and on behalf of the Tsepamo study team, I'll be presenting an update on neural tube defects with antiretroviral exposure in the Tsepamo study, Botswana. Here are my disclosures. To remind you, the Tsepamo study has been ongoing since August of 2014. It's a birth outcome surveillance study at government maternity wards throughout Botswana. It's conducted by the Botswana Harvard AIDS Institute Partnership and funded by NICHD. Roger Shapiro is the PI. Tsepamo was originally designed to evaluate for neural tube defects with exposure to ephedrins at conception, and to evaluate for other adverse birth outcomes by HIV status and use of ART. Dolutegravir was rolled out nationwide in Botswana in mid-2016, allowing for the inclusion of DTG in all comparative analyses. The methods for Tsepamo are pretty straightforward. Research assistants abstract data from maternity cards for all consecutive in-hospital births at maternity wards. Trained government midwives alert the Tsepamo research assistants when they find an abnormality on the infant surface exam. Photos of these abnormalities are taken with maternal consent and reviewed by a medical geneticist blinded to all exposures. For all potential neural tube defects, medication exposures from the time of conception, including ART, are confirmed by the mothers and by review of medical records. At the beginning of the study and through July 2018, we worked at the 8 largest maternity sites in the country, which represented about 45% of all births in the country. Between July and September 2018, we expanded from 8 to 18 sites, covering 72% of all births, and since September 2019, we've maintained this surveillance at 16 of those sites, about 70% of all births in the country. In May of 2018, we first reported on the possible safety signal. This was after our study was asked by WHO to provide any preliminary data on women on DTG from conception for their upcoming HIV Guidelines Committee meeting. And we found a surprisingly high prevalence of neural tube defects, 0.94%, among 426 women on DTG at conception, which was much higher than all the other exposure groups, which were all around our expected prevalence of 0.1%. Last year in Mexico City, we presented data updated through the end of March of 2019, with one additional NTD among 1,275 additional exposures to DTG at conception, a prevalence of 0.3%, which was reassuringly lower, but still statistically significantly increased compared to the other exposure groups. But the absolute difference of 0.2% was very small. Tsepamo has continued since this time, and we're now able to present results through April 30th, 2020. Since our last report, we've had 28 additional neural tube defects among 39,200 additional births, including 2 new NTDs among 1,908 additional exposures to DTG at conception, 6 NTDs among 4,569 more exposures to non-DTG at conception, 5 NTDs specifically among 2,999 on ephedrins at conception, 1 new NTD among 741 exposed to DTG starting during pregnancy, and this was started in the 20th week of gestation, and 17 NTDs among 30,258 births to women without HIV. The 2 new cases of NTDs with DTG conception exposure were first a lumbosacral myelomeningocele with a photo born to a 32-year-old woman, G3P2, with no medical history, not on any other medications, and not on folate at conception. Her weight was 107 kilograms at 21 weeks gestation age when she presented for antenatal care. She had started her DTG in June of 2018, her LMP was April of 2019, and she delivered a live-born infant in January of 2020. The next case was an encephalocele with a photo. The baby was born to a 27-year-old woman, G3P2, also without any medical history, any other medications, and no folate supplementation at conception. She had a weight of 58 kilograms at 13 weeks gestation when she presented. She started her DTG in 2016. Her LMP was in July 2019, and she delivered in April of 2020. So here in the dark line, you can see what's happened to the prevalence of NTDs with DTG at conception over the last year since our last report. There are now a total of 7 NTDs and 3,591 exposures to DTG at conception, and the prevalence has decreased from 0.3% to a prevalence of 0.19%. The prevalence of NTDs in the other exposure groups have not changed substantially since our last report. In non-DTG at conception exposures, there have been a total of 21 neural tube defects in 19,361 exposures, a prevalence of 0.11%. Among exposures specifically to ephedrins at conception, there are a total of 8 neural tube defects among 10,958 exposures, a prevalence of 0.07%. For those who started DTG during pregnancy, there are 2 NTDs among 4,581 exposed for a total of 0.04%. And among women without HIV, there have been a total of 87 neural tube defects in 119,630 exposures, a prevalence of 0.07%. The prevalence difference between DTG conception and all other exposure groups has also decreased since our last report. The prevalence difference between DTG at conception and non-DTG at conception went from 0.20 to 0.09%. The difference between DTG at conception and ephedrins at conception went from 0.26 to 0.12%. The difference between DTG at conception and DTG started during pregnancy went from 0.27 to 0.15%, and the difference between DTG at conception and women without HIV was 0.12%. These prevalence difference estimates now suggest about 1 excess neural tube defect per 1,000 births exposed to DTG at conception, with the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval hovering just below or just about 0. So in conclusion, after a period of decline since the original safety signal, the prevalence of NTDs among infants born to women on dolutegravir at conception may be stabilizing at approximately 2 per 1,000. And there's just a ton of people to acknowledge who make this study run. Most importantly is our amazing group of Tsepamo research assistants who work day in, day out, holidays, often alone at remote sites, to do an unbelievable job at getting this data for the world. Thank you.